Finally tonight, the Detroit Journalism Cooperative and the Detroit Public Television's One Detroit are rolling out a year-long project that explores whether conditions have improved in Detroit since the 1967 riots. Detroit Public Television is one of the DJC partners, along with WDET Radio, Bridge Magazine, Michigan Radio, and New Michigan Media. The DJC was formed to focus on stories about community life and Detroit's future after bankruptcy. And I spoke with Lester Graham of Michigan Radio and David Zeman of Bridge Magazine about this ambitious new project. All right, David, let me start with you. What was the decision process to actually pick going back to 1967 as this next year's project with the DJC?
Sure. Well, it was a pivotal time, obviously, in the city's history. And what we wanted to do was not just look at it as a history project. We wanted to see what kind of gains the city has made since then. And part of the impetus of it was, certainly the things that have happened around the country and in Ferguson and Baltimore and North Charleston and other places. There's just been a lot of talk about whether the gains that have been made in the central business district in Detroit in recent years, which have been wonderful, to what extent they're going to extend out to the neighborhoods as well. And so we want to look at a series of issues, a series of conditions that were present back at a terrible time in the city's history, and see how far the city has come in that respect.
It's an ambitious project, but Lester, what's the fine line that you have to walk in doing this, that you're not just looking back and saying, oh, look at everything that happened back then, and doing basically a retread of history? What's that fine line of not getting caught back in the weeds and just saying, look what happened?
I think the critical part of it is we looked at the Kerner Report, which was a presidential commission which issued a report about racial relations in the United States. That Kerner Report was issued in '68, and if you read it today, it would be so relevant. You would read it and think, oh, really? And we've not made very much progress since '68 on these issues. So we're trying to make sure that we take a look at the grievances of Black America then, how they relate to today, see how we compare, whether we've made any advances. The unfortunate thing about the Kerner Report is President Johnson, who appointed the commission, and Congress at the time, both basically ignored it. Policymakers didn't do anything with that information, and that's why we are where we are today.
All right, so you take a look at the Kerner Report, and so now you start to pull out the various pieces of what the coverage is going to be. How do you break that down, David? Well,
the Kerner Report looked at a number of crucial topics. What is the level and quality of education? What kind of job prospects are there for the people who live in Detroit and cities like Detroit that sort of exploded that summer? What are the relations like between police and the community? So there are these benchmarks that we were able to take that Lester's referring to back then, and we wanted to see what kind of progress has been made since then. So it really gave us sort of a starting point, not to sort of dwell on history, but as a starting point to sort of measure our progress since then.
I think it's interesting you're starting now with these first installments that start today on power. So what does that really mean to you, Lester, when you started diving into this?
Well, we wanted to see, there were a lot of Black activist organizations in the mid-'60s and '70s. We wanted to see, are there any today, and are they as strong? And what we found is there are a number of them, but most of them popped up recently since the emergency manager was appointed in Detroit. The other thing we've been looking at is it's not just a Detroit story, it's a national story. I just got back from Ferguson, Missouri yesterday to see how they're still struggling with police and community relations. It's going to be a lot of Detroit-centered or centric stories, but it's a national story throughout the series.
So what can we see in Bridge then starting today?
Well, we're looking at the issue of power, and one thing that's different, I believe, Lester, you can correct me, with Ferguson, you have a majority Black area that is still run mostly by white officials. Is that true?
Until recently, yes.
Until recently. In Detroit, what we're looking at is, of course, it's been for decades. African Americans have controlled the bureaucracy and the political machine in Detroit and so forth. But what we found, we looked at a number of ways how Detroit's power and the power of ordinary citizens to have a voice in government has been reduced in a number of ways, through regionalization, through loss of population, through less clout in Lansing and so forth. And so there's this sort of irony because, obviously back in '67, one of the grievances was there weren't a lot of people who look like African-American Detroiters in positions of power. Now there is, and yet in some respects, Detroit has less clout.
It's interesting, as journalists, sometimes we know when we start a story, you have an idea of what road you're going to be going down to. Lester, what surprises did you find when you started digging into this?
I found a number of them. Mike Wilkinson at Bridge Magazine has been doing some data research, looking at the census reports from 1970 to today. And we're finding that by a lot of measures, residents of Detroit, black residents of Detroit, are in worse shape now than they were during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. That was really surprising to me. And as we try to look at why we have white attitudes, why white attitudes were so biased toward blacks in the 1960s, whether that's changed, and we're finding so far anecdotally, that's not changed much either. I think the presidential campaign that we're seeing right now kind of indicates that, kind of reflects that.
Our thanks to Lester and David, and you can look for stories throughout the year on the progress of the DJC project right here on Detroit Public Television.